You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Han Solo. That's right, every Wookiee's favorite right-hand man is here to help me with this episode. And as we do when we're Han Solo, I've got some programming notes for Talking Headways for the future shows and episodes, and coming soon on the podcast. We're super excited about that. We're going to have some guests hopefully soon for the Monday show. I know that I always say that, but I'm going to make sure of it this next few times, I promise, trying to get some folks on the show to throw ideas back and forth. But in the meantime, we'll talk about the news as it is, and looking forward to that. But coming soon on the podcast on Talking Headways, where we do have a guest every week, we've got some great shows coming up, including one on sidewalk delivery robots, which should be coming out either this week or next week. We've got a high-speed rail episode planned. We've got 4 recordings scheduled for Railvolution that I'll hopefully share more about when I'll get back to home, and really looking forward to those. There's some really good ones in there. And Railvolution is actually this weekend. So we're going to be recording on Sunday, or actually Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and got a number of episodes planned for when we're at the conference. So I'm excited about that. And if you're there, if you're at Railvolution in Miami this next Sunday through Wednesday, come say hi. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody. It's been a long time since I've actually been out of the house to a conference or some other work-related event, and I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm excited as well. I think I'm nervous because of the pandemic continuing and all of the coronavirus still out there. So I'm vaxxed, but at the same time, there's still always a risk, getting involved with that stuff. So, but looking forward to seeing people for sure. And I'll be wearing my Cars Are Cholesterol t-shirt and probably one of the scarves, if not the t-shirt. So you'll be able to find me for sure. And as I said, I'm looking really, really forward to seeing everybody. But yeah, so coming up also, Stephanie Gideby and Helen Chin will be back, and they're going to be talking about the year anniversary of the infrastructure bill, which, surprising, it's almost here. It's amazing, right? And I've got a book here on my desk written by Joanna Hoffman called Speculative Futures, which is about designing cities, which is going to be interesting as well. We have folks on talking about Dutch soundscapes in cities, which is going to be cool. Bus service in San Diego, and Dr. Nadia Anderson from INRIX is actually going to be on the show as well. So lots of stuff planned for the end of the year. Hopefully we can, make it exciting and get some really cool interviews in, and folks will enjoy what they're listening to. And again, thanks to everybody who listens, and stay tuned as we get there. So I mentioned the Cars Are Cholesterol t-shirt. We've designed the shirt or mug or sticker or poster or whatever you want with Richard Wozensky, who actually, if you are into Instagram and you are into Inktober, which is going on right now, which is basically there's a prompt and people do stuff every day, artists, and they do really cool stuff throughout the whole month of October. Go check out his site, Dick David Sketches. Really cool. So Richard helped us design the Cars Are Cholesterol t-shirt, and his art is really cool. He does lots of robots and stuff like that, which is really awesome. I hope folks can go check it out on Instagram if you get a chance. Dick David is his handle. But yeah, we're selling the shirts and all the merch at TeePublic, and we'll leave a link in the show notes for that if you guys are interested. The design is really cool. Richard did a great job on it. You can use bit.ly/carsarecholesterol to get there. And as I've advised folks before, get the purple one. It's really cool. Also, it's that time of the year where we start getting cozy in our houses. It's cool outside, and we read a lot of books. So you know that we have a lot of authors on the show, and so you can actually support us and support the authors by going to our bookshop page. You can do that by going to bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. Lots of folks have been ordering books. People have been ordering Better Buses, Better Cities by Stephen Higashide, Constructing Community by Jeremy Levine, which we'll actually talk about later in this episode. And, really lots of thanks for folks who have been mentioning on Twitter and other places that they've bought books through Bookshop from us through our shop. And like I said, a couple of dollars goes to us when you buy a book through there, which is really great. Obviously, we want you to start off with the publisher, go to your local bookstores, but before you go to Amazon or anywhere else in the big box stores or something like that, get it from us through Bookshop. Bookshop.org/shop/The Overhead Wire. Okay, this is episode 120. We're in session. And as you all know, you can get this podcast through iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you so much for subscribing through the podcatchers. It's great that you guys keep coming back to the show, and we really do appreciate it. We've been getting a lot of listeners, and it's been really great to see people continue to download the show. And the show's been actually used in classes too, in the newsletter as well. So I'm really appreciative of that too. And hopefully soon, I'm trying to work with APA on getting the podcast certified for credits for continuing education for AICP. So look out for that in the future. I hope we can get that worked out, but I've been back and forth with the folks at APA recently on that. So hopefully that can get sorted, and then folks can use the podcast as continuing education credit, which is really cool because that's what I'm trying to do is hopefully educate folks about what's going on out there. And the authors, I think, are trying to do the same thing that we have on the show, the people that write research papers and just share information. That's kind of what the Overhead Wire is all about, which is really cool. Okay, let's get to the news, shall we? Here are first few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks. As you know, we have a newsletter, the Overhead Wire newsletter, which comes out every day. Monday through Friday, and Monday through Thursday for the basic version, Monday through Friday for the premium version, and we throughout the week collect articles from here and look at what people are clicking on the most to see what is a popular topic, and then we take those articles and we recycle them back into the Monday show and talk about them in a little bit more detail, which is a pretty fun way to do it. So if you want a free trial, no credit card necessary, just your email address. If you want a free trial for 2 weeks, go to theoverheadwire.com and click on the buttons on the top right of the site to sign up. So let's get into the news, shall we? Anemic process on self-driving cars. Even after $100 billion in investment and 6 years of transporting passengers, automobile and technology companies are still nowhere near making a profit from releasing self-driving vehicles onto the road. Even once evangelical supporters of the movement have resigned themselves to working with vehicles in constrained environments. Supporters still believe that autonomous vehicles will be ready eventually, but it may take decades. This was by Max Chafkin in Bloomberg Businessweek. It was a big, central story in the magazine. If you listen to the Talking Headways podcast and episodes with Paris Marks recently, and even Peter Norton, you'd already know that, the topic that self-driving cars are not going to be here anytime soon. It's a sales pitch to generate VC money and hype, but it's actually not anywhere close to being a reality. And, a lot of technology people are finally saying this out loud. And someone said yesterday, I think, that they still believe it's 10 years out, but that's still another date that they're giving. Like, oh yeah, we know it's going to be 10 years from now, but they really don't know. It's one of those things where you really don't know when it's actually going to be here. So I think people are really excited about the idea of it. It's very science fiction. It's very cool to think about. Maybe we can cut traffic fatalities by, self-driving vehicles. But what we found out recently is that a lot of the advanced driver assist program stuff that is in cars now is actually, people rely on it too much and they think all cars are already self-driving, and they're not. So that actually causes a lot more problems too. So there's a lot of frustration with this field and this idea of self-driving vehicles because it does feel like a pitch, and it's felt like a pitch for a really long time. And people, started saying back in 2000, the early 2010s and such, that we're going to have them soon, but then they're not here. So I think maybe eventually it'll get there. You'd probably need some advancements in AI or something along those lines to make it actually happen. You need to deal with snow and ice and other things that humans are really have a hard time dealing with. And those pesky pedestrians and cyclists that so many people who are working on autonomous vehicles would love to get rid of the streets, rid off the streets so that they can actually run their toy cars. But it's not, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. There's going to be a lot of advancement in technology for vehicles, I'm sure, but just not going to be completely autonomous. And apparently, even after, like they said, $100 billion in investment, and still many, many years, decades, maybe a century down the road. Okay. The benefits of reimagining parking spaces. Researchers for a local business association in Toronto found that the parking that was replaced by outdoor restaurant seating and other uses during the pandemic generated $181 million in sales. The parking spaces would have generated $3.7 million in revenue in the same time frame if they were dedicated to cars. The results showed that the negative economic and social effects of incentives that prioritize car parking over public space for people. This was by Oliver Moore at the Globe and Mail. One of our Toronto favorites, Oliver Moore, put this piece together and looked at how much a car parking space was worth if it was used for other things. Of course, this won't always be the case. Not every parking spot is worth something more. There's parking spaces in the middle of nowhere that are worth nothing still. But in a dense urban environment where prices are at a premium for land, the spaces are definitely worth a lot in big cities and things like that. And one thing I should note is that while you can monetize the spots on the spot, there's probably value that comes from there being things other than car parking spaces that might be harder to find like a value for. You can talk about, obviously, in this article and the research in Toronto, showing that the sales generated from those spaces. But, there's other things like nature that are very valuable that we have a hard time putting a monetary value on, or we do put a monetary value in, but it's extremely undervalued. And I think it's called nature services or something along those lines. If you want to look something that up, where people basically, if you leave the land fallow, it's actually valuable on its own. But for parking spaces, I feel like there's also benefit to thinking about them as land, as urban land owned by the city, and that has value. And kind of goes back to actually that discussion we had about the public wealth of cities. One of the biggest land owners in cities is obviously the cities themselves, and they own all of the right-of-ways that people travel on, and they allow them to be used for cars, but they could be used for other things as well. It seems like, especially after the pandemic, we learned that there's a lot of other opportunities out there, especially like outdoor dining and things like that. So, urban real estate has value because there's people that live there, and for many spots, we probably should do something more than just provide affordable housing for cars. So I think that's really interesting. I think it's really interesting that they actually were able to monetize it and kind of show people how much more value there is in the parking spaces when they're used for something else like outdoor restaurant dining. But, I don't imagine that a lot of cities are actually going to do too many studies about like this, going forward, because there's already a pushback against the outdoor dining, against the sheds and things like that in cities that were, hot during the pandemic, but maybe not so hot right now with drivers. And drivers are a big constituency with a loud voice, and we need to kind of push back on that, but at the same time, trying to make small changes and make them permanent is a good goal. Okay, recycling a 14-story building. In Amsterdam, the Dutch are recycling all of the materials from a 14-story tower that would be a model blueprint for waste reduction around the world. The idea comes from the regenerative economy and cradle-to-grave thinking about materials. Given that 40% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions originate from the raw materials needed for construction, integrating reuse into the life cycle of these materials could aid the effort to reduce global emissions. And this was by Jessica Camille Aguirre in the New York Times. I think a lot more of these stories are going to come out where people are recycling buildings, recycling other things. The interesting thing about this one in particular was that the admission that most of the recycled waste that is taken out of buildings, especially in a place like the Netherlands, which really focus on this, is actually downcycled into roads and used for energy production and through incineration, which in many cases is still creating emissions. They also say that recycling is okay, but reuse would be best, and that means taking pieces from a building and using it in other buildings, not necessarily downcycling. So taking out the fixtures, taking out all of the cubicle squares and things like that, and using them in other places. And ultimately, we need buildings that are kind of, it seems like, made from a kit of parts that can then be taken and reused again when the building is taken down. And companies really need to think of things this way when goods and policies need to be better thought out when it comes to the circular economy, and actually having something there that requires that kit of parts, or requires that the recycling can take place later on, because you can't really do it after. It's harder to do after the fact. You can do it after the fact, but it's harder to do after the fact. And it says, in the article, it actually says that for the next 4 decades, built space on the order of the square footage of another New York City will be added to the planet every month. That's a lot of building materials, and that's a lot of waste when when something is ripped out to put something new in, especially in a place like New York City or cities around the world where they're replacing smaller buildings with larger ones. A lot of waste, but also a lot of opportunity too. So there's a lot of opportunity for recycling. And I think that we could be wasting less. I imagine. I really do think that this is a good step forward in terms of thinking about our emissions overall and the cycle of emissions that comes from the cradle to grave, as it were. Okay, office buildings' largest emissions are the commuter. Commuting is an office building's main indirect source of emissions. Some estimate emissions from commuting contribute 15% more carbon than the total operating emissions of a given urban office building. As the COVID-19 pandemic changes commuting patterns, firms are examining how the trip to and from work may provide an opportunity to reduce emissions. And this was by Anna Staropoli in the Commercial Observer. They've had some good articles lately, the Commercial Observer. So basically, a building, if it's 100% emissions from a building, it's 115% emissions from the commute to the building, which is pretty crazy. It's like doubling up on your emissions from that commute. And I often think about this when we talk about LEED and other buildings that are, super energy efficient, but they're in the middle of nowhere. And I think that, they came up with LEED ND and some other things, and they've leadership in energy efficient design, I guess and they have their awards, LEED Gold, LEED Platinum, and stuff like that. But and they've been beat up about this a lot anyway. But I still feel like there's something to be said about the emissions from traveling to and from a place, and not just the place itself. There's an impact to that, and a lot of emissions apparently come from people getting to and from work and other places. And obviously, we know that from all the transportation emissions that happen. But it's something that you have to connect the dots to put them together, because it's all a symbiotic system, right? It's not just like transportation emissions over here, building emissions over here, and other emissions over there, airplane emissions, we'll talk about later. But they're all one system, and so I think that combining them and thinking about them together is actually a really important point, which is really a good point made by this article in the Commercial Observer. But this is why TDM, transportation demand management, and other strategies are so important, making sure that the building owners or the companies that are in the buildings offer ways for people to get to work that aren't just driving, that actually can reduce emissions and reduce traffic and get their people to and from work, if they're coming into work, better and more efficiently. So it's really interesting to think about that, especially from combining all those in that symbiotic system that we're talking about. So emissions aren't just one thing; they're many things, but they're also combined because we live in this big system that's emitting pollutants every day. Okay. Oh, and on TDM, I should also note that on TDM we actually talked to some folks recently on the podcast and on the Revolution podcast, which I'm also a host of. Which actually we repost the Revolution podcast at Talking Headways eventually. But if you want to listen to that one, it's not out on our podcast, but you can go to the Revolution podcast and listen to that episode on TDM, Transportation Demand Management. It's really cool. Tim Chan is on the show as well as other folks too. So it's good. It's a good discussion. Okay, Charlotte's Uptown Highway Wall. Completed in 1988, I-277 in Charlotte, North Carolina, cuts off the uptown area from the rest of the city and physically symbolizes the inequity integrated into our city's urban fabric. Advocates have proposed a few ways to lessen the negative impact of one I-277 on adjacent communities, and there is a mounting political will to act on these proposals on the local and national levels. This was by Eli Portillo at Charlotte Magazine. I did a blog post about this back in the Blogspot days, theoverheadwire.blogspot.com, that looked at turning this highway, specifically I-277 that's choking Charlotte, and re-envisioning it into a Vienna-style Ringstrasse. It was fun to reimagine the space and draw maps and color code and think about putting trams in there and stuff like that. But the highway never should have been built in the first place, so we shouldn't even have to worry about imagining a new way to think about it, whether it's filling it in and having something over the top, or making it into, some people say they wanted to make it into a river or a creek, and it was kind of funny too, because it is kind of depressed through the downtown. But yeah, there's something to be said for just like, having your downtown and then having it cut off from the rest of the neighborhoods around it by this kind of this just like choking highway, which is ridiculous. And if you ever get a chance, like it's worse than any other freeway, I think, highway, I should say. I got to stop using. I keep on using freeway, and I've been meaning to stop using the nomenclature, but. It's really bad. So take look at an aerial photo and go back and check it out, and it'll be really interesting to see what folks have or think of it. Actually, it's really really bad in terms of how it disconnects neighborhoods, and really it shouldn't have been built. But if you want to kind of go get an overview of it, definitely check out this article. We'll have all the articles as we always do in the show notes. So check that out if you get a chance. Eli does a great job. He was a reporter for the Charlotte Observer for a really long time, and now works at the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute, which is a great place to get information about what's going on in Charlotte and city politics and things like that. Okay. Rethinking the benefits of community input. Complicated permitting systems and lawsuits slow much-needed infrastructure projects from becoming a reality. Jerusalem Demsis argues that we need to rethink community input to allow projects that benefit people and the environment to come to fruition in a timely and cost-effective manner. So the title of this article is actually called "Not Everyone Should Have a Say," and that made some people really upset on Twitter. It was really interesting to see kind of the discussions around this piece, which, many of the folks that kind of bashed on the article actually seemed like they didn't really read it, because there's a lot of their points in there and discussing them in detail. But I should say there was like a really interesting article today on Twitter about public input, and unfortunately, like a moron, I didn't save it so I could give the person credit who said this. But basically, someone was saying that perhaps public input should be more like jury duty and less like old white men yelling at clouds. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I understand why people are clinging to localism these days, and obviously certain projects are likely to impact some people, more than others. But it seems that the public input has gotten to the point where everyone says no, or it takes a million years to do anything. It's not really a way for government to run the way we want it to run, and have government run in a way that people think actually works well. All this stoppages and takes forever, it just makes people mad. And, Jerusalem had a really long thread about some of that pushback that I was mentioning. But I think the article pretty much speaks for itself, especially the quotes from the two representatives on the House Resources Committee, Grijalva and Mikichin, which they both agreed that things needed to speed up, but didn't want to take away from community input or NEPA, the legal process. And I really also like the discussion about the chilling effect of NEPA that could also be a part of the CEQA discussion here in California. And people talk all the time, the defenders, they always talk about how only a certain amount of projects, 1% of projects get NEPA'd, or 1% of projects get CEQA'd, but they don't talk about all the projects that died because of the threat of a NEPA lawsuit or a CEQA lawsuit. And it's like in cycling, where they don't really measure close calls where you almost get hit. They only measure the collisions, which certain roads are really, really dangerous. And just because nobody's died yet doesn't mean it's not gonna happen, because so many people have had these encounters. And it's the same thing with NEPA and CEQA. There's a chilling effect of development projects that happens. And so you can say that there's only a small amount that are killed by NEPA or that go really far, but the number is actually much higher, and there should be some more research on that, because it seems like maybe there is actually already, and I just haven't seen it, but it really seems like that's kind of one of the key factors of NEPA and CEQA that people aren't really talking about. And in terms of community input overall, I think we've seen over the last few decades that, especially when it comes to alternative energy and these this opposition from shell groups for oil companies, they basically pay a guy associated with some Washington think tank, like the Heritage Foundation or something like that. And, the person lives in the area and they oppose it, and they say that they're a part of the community that opposes it, and their neighbors oppose it and all that stuff. But then you just find that it's a shell group made up of, money coming from somewhere else that pays this guy's salary to go to all the public meetings and oppose it and say that he's part of this larger group. And I think that that's something that we talked about in Jeremy Levine's book as well, when we had him on Talking Headways, which is, there's people saying that they represent the community, but which community are they representing? And they're only representing a certain part of it. And there's a lot of other people left out, and there's got to be a better way to get kind of input from folks or understand kind of the larger impacts of these projects and whether they're good or not, from an environmental standpoint, but also from a public good standpoint. So if we're worried about public input and stopping projects, we have all these alternative energy projects that we want to use, or renewable energy projects, I should say, that we want to push forward with the Inflation Reduction Act. But what happens is a lot of them get pushed on, the transmission projects and things like that get pushed back on because of NEPA and opposition. And somebody found out recently that actually a lot of the opposition, as I mentioned before, was from these shell groups. So the permitting process should be a lot better. It should be faster. Obviously, people need to have a say. We need to keep bad actors from doing bad things like running freeways through urban neighborhoods. But at the same time, we need to get projects like permitting, transmission and other things done faster, transit projects done faster. I just saw actually today that Austin is actually talking about, speeding up their permitting process and actually treating the project as one big project rather than just individual parcel by parcel. It would take forever to do that. And give the permits from the city of Austin to actually build the project. So there's maybe some progress being made on that. But I think the crux of the article remains true, is that we need to really rethink community input when the only community input is no. Okay, a couple more in the main materials here. The camouflaged Costco in Mexico City. Costco has 800 big box stores around the world, but most of them are boxes. The 525,000 square foot store in Mexico City is completely covered by a public park. The park includes sports courts and a green roof that are meant to be the extension of an adjacent park created from a landfill that was once a sand quarry. This was by one of our favorites, Nate Berg in Fast Company. I don't really have much to say about this, but I just thought it was really interesting, and people seem to think it was interesting as well. And there's some pictures on the Fast Company site of this Costco, this urban Costco that's covered by an urban park. Maybe we should do that more often. It'd be kind of cool. Use these big box stores and let them stay underground and put something useful on top. That in addition to that big box store and maybe more than just a parking lot. Okay, Helsinki's cold water heating solution. Cold seawater from the bottom of the Baltic could heat and cool Helsinki through underground heat pumps. Currently, most buildings are warmed through a district heating system which sources 75% of its energy from fossil fuels. To reach a citywide goal of carbon neutrality by 2030, the 500 megawatt heating plant needs to be operational in about 7 years. So this was in Bloomberg CityLab. Thomas Gualtieri and Kati Pohjanpalo. I hope I said their names right. I apologize if not. I like these renewable energy schemes. They're pretty cool. It's actually basically operates like a heat pump, and you take the cold water from the bottom and it creates some mismatch in the temperatures, and it turns some turbines, I imagine, and gets going and changes the temperature. It heats up space, and so you take cold and you make heat, and really interesting. I hope more places can actually get something like that done and try to get away from fossil fuels, for heating elements. Anyways, I don't know if I have much to say about that. It's pretty cool. I just thought it was interesting. Okay, so here are a couple of bonus materials. These are parts of the newsletter that folks didn't necessarily click on as much as the ones that we just talked about, but I thought that they were interesting anyways and wanted to share them with you. So first off, LA is one of the most overcrowded cities in the United States. To understand how it got that way, LA Times reporters dug into old newspapers articles and reports going back to when the city was founded. What they found was a lack of concern for crowding from politicians and the slow growth movement. So this was in the Los Angeles Times. This is the problem I see with blocking housing. In California especially, it's crowded, and in the Outer Mission, where my mom grew up, there are homes with a number of families living on different levels in what is a single family home. And, it's expensive, so there's a lot of makeshift accommodations. So when someone says we're short X number of units throughout the state, I actually think it might be more. And, the overcrowding has other issues as well, especially from a public health standpoint. During the pandemic, these areas where people are crowding together in homes was where a lot of the transmission of the COVID virus happened. So I'm sure it's like that during, other times of the year and with other respiratory health issues, even pre-COVID. I'm sure whole households would get the flu or get colds and things like that, and because they're all crowded in the same room. And so this is a real issue, this crowding, and I think it happens in more places than Los Angeles, but Los Angeles is a particularly crowded place, and really that just necessitates the need for building more housing and making housing cheaper so that more people can live in their own rooms and have a little bit of space to themselves. I think it would be beneficial overall, probably for a lot of people's mental health and family dynamics. Okay, Colorado residents will vote on a ballot initiative that would carve out money from the state income tax for affordable housing while also giving tenants a share of any profits from the development after living in them for a year. This was in Next City. So I don't quite understand this ballot measure completely, but I'll try to explain it. This is Prop 123 in Colorado, and it would set aside 0.1% of income taxes for affordable housing, which equals about $290 million. But there's also a tenant equity vehicle, which makes up between 69 and 121 million of that 290 million. And after the construction of an affordable housing project, a share of the value created from rents would be put into a fund for each tenant that lived in the place for a year, which could then be used for future purchase of a home. So basically, these tenants get a share of the profits for wealth building to buy a home in the future, which is actually a really cool idea. And basically, the whole idea is that the state would operate like a construction lender and allow developers to build projects with the money that they raise, but part of the value that's created would go back to the tenants, part of the profits at the end. And so, this is something new that hasn't really been tried before, but I think it's kind of a cool idea. And there really needs to be ways to, create, profit sharing with tenants and create wealth building opportunities for tenants as well. Otherwise, they're just going to keep spending money on rent and maybe they never had enough for a down payment for a house, but maybe this time or now they would. And so it gives them an opportunity to do that even if they're renting. So I think that's really cool. There obviously needs to be a yes vote on Prop 123 in Colorado in a couple of days. But there also needs to be more details ironed out, but let's see how things pan out. It seems a pretty cool idea. Okay, in Mexico, a 700-year-old farming technique in the form of floating farms called chinampas could create a more sustainable modern local agriculture. Invented by the Aztecs to farm the lakes near what is now Mexico City, the pandemic brought the chinampas, I hope I'm saying that right, back to life as important sources of local farming and agriculture. This was by BBC Travel. BBC Travel is killer lately. I've loved a lot of their articles. They're just so in-depth and so cool and on topics that are just out there, but still urban focused. You see these chinampas on travel food shows like Somebody Feed Phil on Netflix and things like that. So, when people go to Mexico City, they often go to here, which is where a lot of the local urban agriculture is. And so a lot of the restaurants they go and they get it's kind of a farm to table situation. So it's pretty cool. They basically are like these floating islands, and they put reeds underneath so that they float, and so that they actually have their own ecosystem in terms of how they operate. It's really interesting. The article really explains it really well, so go check it out if you get a chance. Like I said, in the show notes. Okay. People are unlikely to give up flying, which produces 2.5% of global emissions. So a new report by the International Council on Clean Transportation says that perhaps those that fly should be taxed for it. Most Americans take 2 or less trips per year and wouldn't be affected, but business travelers who fly all over for work could be increasingly taxed for each flight. Washington Post. So finally, this is the last piece. Emissions from flying are mostly from superflyers that fly all the time, or the Kardashians who fly short distances and pollute the air around them in Van Nuys, which is an LA Times article today, actually, or yesterday. But I think a tax on frequent flyers wouldn't be a bad thing if it actually reduced emissions. I wonder, what would happen if you actually did it for private jets, and that might be actually an easier sale than commercial airlines. But the frequent flyers that are flying, more than 2 or 3 or 4 times a year are the ones that are creating most of the emissions. So there's something to think about. Maybe there's a tax, and it might not be too much, and it might be just a part of their business expenses. They might already be paying hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in flight anyways. So what's another $25 per trip or something like that for a carbon tax or a frequent flyer tax that actually goes back into to something good to reducing emissions. So interesting idea for taxing frequent flyers that actually create a lot of the emissions. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for listening. Well, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you our bus-only or bike-only scarf. You just have to ask for which one when you sign up. I know I have also scarf. You can purchase the scarf online. Just go to the front page of theoverheadwire.com. If you want a scarf on its own, in addition to being a Patreon supporter, you can do that too. And we really appreciate that. And they've been going people have been really enjoying the scarves. People really like the bike only scarf. So really fun. Hopefully folks can get some for their friends for Christmas. For their colleagues for Christmas. I think a lot of folks have been doing that in the past, and I think that'll probably be the case this year as well. So looking forward to sending out a bunch of scarves to folks who want them. All right. And also, I want to mention that we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning in Practice, and get your hands on one by going to raymondunwin.com. Listener questions and comments. If you have a comment or question, feel free to tweet or email us, show up on any of the social sites where the podcast appears as well. Feel free to email theoverheadwire@gmail.com if you have any questions. That's the best way to connect with us. And thanks everybody for your emails the last few weeks. Well, this is Puppies and Butterflies time. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in the other sections. And I'm super excited now to talk about Searching for Italy with Stanley Tucci. It's back on CNN. I really can't wait for the episode on Liguria whenever that is coming out, which is part of Italy where part of my family's from. And I've been there to check it out as well, especially the little town where my mom's family's from. So that was really cool. Highly recommend the show. I just really enjoy it. I don't know. It's something about talking about food in Italy and just good memories and thoughts about, all kinds of things, climate change, sustainable farming, local cuisine, all kinds of really cool stuff. Really good urban, views as well. Lots of stuff in cities. So definitely check that out if you get a chance. CNN, Searching for Italy with Stanley Tucci. And then also, this Han Solo appreciator is also loving Andor on Disney+. I think it's one that you can watch even if you're not into the Star Wars lore and all that stuff. So I think it might pull you in even if you're not a big Star Wars fan. So be careful. You get pulled in. But yeah, I'm really liking that show. It's really a slow burn. It's more like a psychological thriller than it is like a fantasy space epic that Star Wars usually is. But there's still a lot of connections to Star Wars. It's just more intentional in terms of the kind of suspense that's created. And I think that's really cool. And it's a really fun show, and I can't wait to watch it every week after Cora goes to sleep, of course. All right. Well, you can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire and at theoverheadwire.com. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for supporting this week's podcast. And we'll see you after Railvolution next time.
Talking